Hello and welcome to Spotlight On. I'm your host, Lawrence Purrier. Today the spotlight is on David Whitehead. David is a longtime artist manager who epitomizes taste and independent spirit in the choice of artists he works with, as well as the perspectives he brings and the actions he takes. As you'll hear from our talk, David cares deeply about his artists and how the modern music business, with all of its challenges and opportunities, impacts them. A stroll through just some of the artists past and present on David's main road management roster include Joe Jackson, Joe Henry, Hugh Laurie, Laurie Anderson, come on, Natalie Merchant, Helmet, Luna, David Byrne, and the man who caused our paths to cross, David Bowie. And yes, I've left several off this list who are equally impressive. What kind of person counsels and guides such a beautiful selection of artists? Let's find out.
Hey.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I am great. It's so good to see you.
Good to see you too. It's been a long time.
It has. You know, I was thinking this morning that it's so funny. I don't know if it's unique to our business or if other people experience this, but, you know, I've known you a long time, but I don't know you well. And,
yes.
But I feel like whenever I do speak with you, like whenever I see you in my inbox or in my social message or something, I get excited. I'm like, oh, it's like a missive from a knowledgeable philosophical person in our industry. And so I don't know. I've just always been very grateful to know you, even though It's not been incredibly, you know, we just haven't known each other well over the years. But
oh, that's sweet. Thank you. Yeah, you too. You know, I've not moved around. You know, you've tried different things. You know, I'm still toiling away at the only thing I can do. You know.
Well, see, my perception of it was you actually found something you're good at, and I'm out there wandering in the wilderness. But
yeah, well, you know what? I think, you know, what's been happening the last sort of year or so. I mean, I think, you know, everybody's trying to find something else that they might be good at, frankly, you know. But it's difficult when you've been doing the same thing for such a long time. You know, it's very difficult to just sort of pick up and find something else, you know, especially when you're 20 or 30 anymore, you know, or even 40, come to that, you know.
Yeah.
And then that's the problem with a lot of artists too. I mean, a lot of the people that I'm working with, and I think a lot of artists in general are just finding a whole different way of trying to earn a living. You know, and look at all the options that they've got, you know, and it's really challenging, you know, it's unprecedented. You know, it's funny because, you know, it's not like there's a plan B, you know, it's not like nobody prepared for this and then, well, we just got a plan B. You know, plan B is really, what is our plan, you know?
Yeah. Well, I wanted to get to that question, but since you've gone there, I'll dive in on that topic.
Yeah.
What has this meant? My perception of a lot of the artists you work with is that they're working artists. You know, they're active, they perform, they record, they work. You know, they stretch sort of the boundaries of what it means to be a recording art. You know, they might work with an orchestra or a symphony or small jazz. You know, they're very creative but working artists.
Right.
What has this meant for specifically the artists on your roster? How have they reacted?
Well, you know, you're right. I mean, most of them are working artists, and most of them, with the exception of one, which would be Hugh Laurie, who has a day job. You know, they're by and large, just like many other artists, 80-90% of their income, you know, on a yearly basis is through touring. It's through recording, it's through touring. And, you know, taking that away has really been the biggest challenge, you know, for many of them. I mean, there are one or two that can ride it out, you know, that's significant enough, you know, that have enough money, that have made their money essentially and can live and perhaps, you know, live by not working again if they have to, you know, but it's, you know, looking at all those options that they have, and I can go through them, and finding what you're comfortable with and what you're not comfortable with, you know, and redoing a way of earning a living, you know. And I was just joking with one of them before Christmas about something, which is sort of, what a way to make a living, eh? You know, I mean, really, you know, because the kind of things that they're doing now, we would have not given two thoughts to, prior to having to come off the road and having no livelihood, So, yeah.
Are there any, I want to talk about some of the obvious things like live streaming and broadcasting from home and all that, but have there been any new creative, interesting opportunities that have come up that you might not have either seen before or entertained before?
No, I mean, none of my current artists are comfortable doing live streaming for different reasons, whether it's their personality, whether it's the fact that, the live streaming, the issues with live streaming. I mean, like a band like Helmet, for instance, there's a physical aspect to what they do playing live. And the whole idea of being up on a stage and having an audience, there's no mosh pit, when it comes to live streaming, there's nothing to feed off, you're telling stories to a screen, or you're telling stories or anecdotes, you're not responding to anything. It's a form of acting in that regard. There's challenges sort of technology wise that make it difficult, and some are more comfortable taking those kind of risks than others. I mean, I've seen a lot of live streams. Some of them have been very good. A lot of them have been lord awful quality-wise, and it just feels like a setback, and, for an artist like Joe Jackson, for instance, who's very specific about the kind of show that he puts on, the pacing of the show, the band, the format, all of those things go out the window when it comes to live streaming. So live streaming, unfortunately, or whatever, for my clients has not really been an option. I mean, it's really just been a question of sort of taking stock inventory of the kind of things that they might want to do or they're comfortable doing, and looking at exercising some of those, but taking stock of their career as a whole and the different ways in which they've made a livelihood and the aspects that could affect that. So, a lot of people have been doing signed lyric sheets, which fans love. Who wouldn't, want their favorite lyrics handwritten, dedicated to them, and I think some people have been very comfortable doing that. Handling special merchandise items, that are exclusive, that involve a personal touch in some regards. Guitar lessons, is something that people seem to really love, doing. And one or two of my clients do that and like doing that, generally like doing that. Nobody I'm working with is doing Cameo, which seems to be taking it one bridge too far. The whole idea of selling 5 minutes of your time, is it just a little uncomfortable,
I don't know. I think Hugh Laurie should sell 5 minutes of his time and he just sits there and berates you.
He could do that. But berate in a very British way.
Yeah. It's funny because I was recently, I'm almost afraid to admit this, but I have this weird fondness for the Ang Lee version of Sense and Sensibility, and I watch it every couple of years, and I always forget about the Hugh Laurie character. And when he comes on screen, I just think I want him to be like that in real life. That's it.
Right. Yeah, usually in real life is, apart from the wit, he's blessed with a remarkable wit, but in real life he's obviously known in this country for one particular role. And in real life, it could be polar opposite, from that particular character, and it's almost like an apologist sort of role that he plays, define that. That's not me, but funnily enough, to this day, I still get letters from people saying, you're the only person that could cure me,
That's amazing.
Or I'm a doctor and I'm inspired by, this, and it is amazing. Yeah. It's remarkable. But, taking inventory is really just looking at, the record deals that they have, the record deals that they could do, publishing situations, whether any publishing deals are up for renewal or not. One or two of my clients have flirted with, well, no, they've not flirted, but have received invitations to sell part of their intellectual property rights, whether it's their publishing copyrights, whether it's their writers' shares, whether it's their them, you know,
Yeah.
and I've got one or two that could do that, but choose not to. And then the others, the people that you approach about things like that are really looking at, 7-figure type income on a yearly basis rather than tens of thousands. They're looking at hundreds of thousands of millions of thousands or whatever, and so, those things are not an option, but just take an inventory and looking at what you can get, and frankly, the inventory aspect of it has been one of the biggest challenges and one of the biggest heartbreaking things, in terms of looking at it now, particularly in regard to record companies and historic deals and the historic deals that some of my artists are saddled with, and the economic disparity, of where the money is in the record industry right now. And I'm actually just writing something right now. I know that last thing I wrote was some music business worldwide, but I'm actually just going to write something for myself and just to put on my own whatever on LinkedIn and things, and just particularly about that economic disparity, which is, in times like this is kind of heartbreaking,
Yeah.
for musicians, who's particularly the commercial work, that they've had, and the body of work and the zenith, if you like, of their career, where that work is tied up, and the difficulty in terms of trying to establish any sense of parity, or not even parity, but just economic fairness, in that is such a struggle. So it's an unfortunate backdrop,
Yeah. Well, you're bringing up something that I've been struggling to, or that I've been turning over in my head over the last maybe 10 days, 3 weeks, whatever it is, really since the Dylan news about his publishing, his deal. And I've been struggling to articulate through my mouth and through my writing utensil what's been going on in my head and heart, which is, and I think it also relates to what you're talking about with the record deals, which is, first of all, I don't begrudge anybody doing what they want with their money and their property. Like I have no opinion or vote over any of that.
Right.
But what it raises for me is that artists are often put into situations where they don't or can't, and we can parse that out, bet on themselves.
Yeah.
And so now we have what looks to me from the outside like largely a generation of artists. I'm still waiting for somebody to do the analysis of the average age of the artists that are doing most of these deals, artists, producers, whoever it is that are selling off their catalogs. But it's a generation, from my perception of artists, that it's the cumulative effect of the things you're talking about. That when they were at the peak of their career, they were doing quite well and thought they were doing quite well, but really what it was is they were doing well enough. They weren't getting the lion's share, and there's a fundamental. I know this isn't original thought, but there is a fundamental problem at the heart of our business as it relates to dealing with artists that is just different from the film and recorded visual business and the way intellectual property is created, managed, contracted. And I don't know what the way out is. I'm not that type of visionary, and I'm not even sure why it's so heartbreaking to me to see these deals happen. But when an artist is at that point in their career where they're selling off a cultural asset, I don't know. It's just it's disturbing to me. And the other point that it brings to me is that there will never be change in copyright laws. If somebody's willing to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on a collection of assets, that means that they know they're going to be able to monetize that for such a long time that copyright is essentially in perpetuity now. There's nothing will ever go to public domain ever again. So that's my rant. I apologize, but I wonder if any of that resonates with you and how you're thinking about this.
Yeah, it does resonate, and I'm thinking a great deal about it. I mean, I can understand why, Bob Dylan, Stevie Nicks, Lindsey Buckingham, Neil Young, Nile Rodgers, Dave Stewart. I mean, I can understand, why these artists are taking the money now, regardless of the tax implications of that, taking the money now and banking it and doing what they want to do with it. Because I think a lot of people look at the industry now, and it's not the industry that they grew up with. And I think the idea of having that money now and choosing to invest it or doing what you're doing with it is more attractive than feeling like you're slugging it out and seeing the money come to a trickle and slowly trickling through on a year by year basis. Some artists, need that trickle. They need that flow because perhaps the deal that they could do would not be big enough by the time you take into account corporate tax, and a capital gains tax, and especially, with the new administration coming in, that might have an impact on that type of level of earnings. I think the hardest thing for me with that, specifically when we talk about copyrights, it's an economic parity. I think the biggest struggle for many is, and I've seen quotes like "broken model," being bandied around, and the effect of streaming, in the music industry. And, streaming is a great thing. I mean, it's an amazing thing. I mean, it's revolutionized our access to music. I can find things. I don't have to rely on the gatekeepers of the press and opinions. I mean, I can just navigate my own way around it. It's terrific. It's not so much the effect of streaming itself, on the business. It's the economic parity of streaming and how that money goes and where it goes to, in terms of what the artist eventually ends up with. There's really causing a lot of the problems. And the broken model, in my mind, is the application of a royalty-based system that was devised, 50, 60 years ago, that has been applied to do method of commercialization and how we do business and sell business. And by and large, every attempt to resist that, particularly at a major record company level, to resist that, and break that model away and strip it down and come up with a new method of remuneration, that is not attached to the royalty method, So, I've kind of diverted a little bit there, but I think, on the publishing world, I always looked at publishing, and this is probably sentimental, but I always looked at publishing as part of an artist's legacy. It's your estate. And if you have nobody that you want to pass any of that estate on to, then God bless, sell it, go forth, take the money, do what you want with it now, spend it, give it away, whatever you want to do with it. But, I look at some artists, and I've always had this sort of, naive, view that, your work in music in particular, your work, your copyrights, whether it's your recorded copyrights, your publishing copyrights, it's your work, it's your legacy, it's your body. And it's like, who wouldn't want to give that to their kids? Who wouldn't give that to their family and let them administer it and keep it in the family and administer it and control it as much as you can? But I think that's only, your ability to do that is only dependent on an income stream and not being attached to deals that were written 20, 30, 40 years ago, that don't allow you to have that, whether it's a publishing deal or whether it's a record deal. And we all know about the Copyright Act of 1976. We all know about, the attempts, and I'm going through it right now, went through it with one of my ex-clients, the attempts to actually, regain control of masters. Yeah. And in the other instance, it was successful. In the current instances, it is being resisted, beyond resistance, I rather than continuing the daily fight, if you could look at it and look at some of the multiples that are being paid right now for the publishing, 10, 15, 20, 25, times are the kind of multiples. And for an artist that's 60, 70 years old, even 50 years old, there's a lot you could do with that money, even after tax.
Well, it's funny. It feels very, and again, it feels very predatory at this particular moment in time,
Yeah.
because you're sitting down with an artist who can't otherwise work right now and can't
Right.
otherwise generate massive income right now, who would maybe typically go out and do a 30-day US tour,
Right.
and then take 2 years off. It's just such a perfect storm for getting those pitches. But your other point is that if somebody's willing to pay a 20 or 30x multiple, that to me just says, well, wow, what's my asset really worth?
Right.
Because if they're paying me 25x, what are they making from it? Yeah. And that I think that goes back to my earlier point, which is I think there's very few instances where anybody gets the artist to think that way.
Yeah.
Because, there's so many of us that make money from artists, and I don't know. It's the flaws in the deals are exactly, you've hit the nail on the head. And it's another topic that I've often wondered about is I sort of hate the narrative of the streaming services are ripping off artists.
Yeah, me too.
Because I know plenty of artists that are getting paid directly by the streaming services that are happy as clams.
Oh yeah. And they're making a living out of it. That's right. I do too. Some of my ex-clients, very comfortable with what they're getting.
Yeah, it's been masterful spin on behalf of the major rights holders, not even the major rights holders, on the industry of rights holders, to pit the streaming services and the artists sort of against each other in that way, or to try to build that narrative. Yeah. It's very interesting. It's very interesting.
Well, paying over the odds is interesting because it's paying over the odds. We know where the money's coming from. The money's not coming from within the record industry. The money's coming from, venture capitalists, who are giving money to people within the record industry to make these kind of deals. And it's interesting that, the artists that might only earn $100,000 a year, not chump change, in terms of sort of publishing royalties, they're not interested. They're not the kind of deals that they're in. And the majority of artists outside of the top 5%, are what you would consider middle class, that maybe earn between $50,000 and $200,000 a year, within that publishing sort of realm. But they're not the artists that are interested, to the venture capitalists, to the companies that are involved in this, and we know who they are, and a lot of that is what is it worth is the question, because again, going back to the way a lot of these deals were structured, particularly record deals and publishing deals, the way they were structured 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago was, perhaps they did give them advances that were a little bit higher than perhaps, the record sales, would merit. Well, not so much higher, but they were higher in terms of how those advances were going to recoup. But what it was doing was sort of building a catalog and building an asset and building a massive amount of assets that over the course of time that they would fight to keep, for forever, essentially, which is what we're looking at. Building a massive trove of assets that, Len Blavatnik, paid $3.3 billion for Warner's, is now valued at more than $12 billion, and Vivendi, which owns Universal, sold a 10% stake for $3 billion, and now the company is valued at $30 billion, but it's valued at that because of the assets that it owns and controls.
That's right.
And it's the accumulation of all these masters. On the record division sides, it's the accumulation of all these masters, that are the assets. So, they're buying these assets and they're probably paying over the odds now, but all they're doing is leveraging the value of these assets in 5, 10, 15 years time when they sell and flip it for, those kind of profits.
Yeah. Well, that's the interesting point, though, is that these assets, it's almost like commercial real estate in that they're always worth more over time. They're
right.
Always worth. So we can go, you talked about the 50, 60, 70-year time horizon in the contracts. Just how this industry's grown and what a what an Elvis Presley master has been has been worth
Right.
over that amount of time, or the Beatles catalog, or not even that. Dave Clark 5. Dave Clark was able to basically walk away from the mainstream music business and live the remainder of his life off of what, 3 to 5 years worth of hits, if even. Like
Right.
what was the heart of Dave Clark's career? 3 years? I'm not even sure. And
Right.
through his own ownership, through having that sort of foresight, the Dave Clark story is fascinating, but he lived quite a fine life
Yeah.
off of
Yeah.
3 years worth of hits. But
Yeah.
I thought another question for you on I guess on this topic is, you mentioned a couple of your artists, either people came sniffing around about their interest, or they said, let's think about this, whatever the genesis was.
Yeah.
At some point, this came on the radar screen. For the level of artists you work with in general, what gets them to know? Is it that the money's not enough, or is it that they have this other sense of what it is they're selling, this feeling about what they're selling?
What gets them to know how to make the decision, or?
No. What gets them to the decision being no, not to sell?
Oh, having people around them that can portray the pros and cons, of doing these kind of things. By and large, that, and I'm not referring to me, I'm referring to business managers, one who you know very well. Mm-hmm. So having that type of advice around them, sometimes it's not a political decision on their part, but it's an ethical thing. It's something that, how does it sit with me? How does the idea of selling the rights to my image and my works sit with me? And I'm not even sure that has anything to do with sort of control. Because I've got to feel like if people are buying intellectual property rights, within those deals, I can't imagine that they're just going to sign over the catalog for the kind of money that they get, even for the kind of money that they get, and say, you can do with me and my works and my image whatever you want. You can put my head on Mickey Mouse. Whatever you want is good with me. I'm not so sure that, there's got to be some sort of, you would think, some parameter of control in there.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of it is just what they're comfortable with. And for some people as well, it's having a choice, and it's how much is enough, and that's a how much is enough, and at what cost, is seems to be the two kind of key dynamics, in some people's minds, and a lot of us, a lot of people, even musicians, I think, even in difficult times like this, they're not just in it for the wealth, they're in it for other things too, and I think, the whole idea of having financial independence, comes with choices that you can make, and creating those choices and being in a lucky situation where you've got that choice as to whether to do these kind of deals or not, and you understand what they mean. And not wanting the money, not needing the money, or necessarily being comfortable with the way things are structured right now, the level of control that you've got right now. I think that stuff can't be discontinued, Yeah. And the unfortunate thing is, I would think, is that some artists probably do have that struggle, but come to the conclusion that they have no choice. But again, those kind of artists, I talked a little bit about that in that last essay that I wrote, but that's mostly on the recording side, where sometimes you will want to do those deals, or you will have to do those deals, because you can see what you're getting out of it will perhaps override any long-term aspects to it, in terms of what your needs are right now versus what your needs may or may not be in 5 years' time, or 10 years' time, or 15 years' time, And the Dave Clark 5 story, which I don't know, is an interesting story, because for every one of those, I bet you can find 10 of a Norman Greenbaum story who sold Spirit in the Sky for chump change, and it generates, tens of hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, through sync placements. I mean, how many times does a song like that pop up, in a commercial or a film or a TV show or, whatever it is, there's more of those instances, unfortunately, than the people that sort of, chose to, keep it,
Yeah. Yeah. I only know the broad contours. I used to know the story better, but the gist of it is that Dave Clark, either always owned everything or got it all back very early, and took and really took his stuff off the market for a long time, and was one of the first artists to do like direct to consumer television in the 70s, the as seen on TV type stuff. Just very smart, very well managed, and and left this earth a very successful, financially secure, independent person. But a lot of it had to do with scarcity. And a lot of discomfort, I think, with the mainstream music business, and just deciding not to do that.
Yeah, the disappointment of it. I understand that. Yeah. Good.
I want to talk a bit about your story, because one of the things that I think is very interesting, though, if I could say it to you, is that the way you present your business, or even the way it's sort of, if I go to your company's website, there's a very human feeling to the way you present your business world. Your story, there's a essay you wrote about your biography, the way you kind of show the inside of your world. It's just a very organic feeling, and I feel like it matches. I know I'm using sort of like corporate talk to something that's probably very organic for you, but the brand feels very consistent, right? Like it's like you have artists that have also a very, I don't know, there's a taste to your roster. It just all feels of a part and parcel, that you've found some artistic and creative and business and lifestyle niche that have all come to serve you, or that you've built a world for yourself. And I wonder, one, like, how am I insane perceiving it that way? How much of that was intentional? And was there a point in your career where you said, I need and want to do something different? Or like, is this what you've been building towards?
Yeah. I think I would be lying to say that if I go back to the very beginning, when I started in music, that I had some sort of sense of vision or goal about what I wanted to do with my life or my career, but I think as I got older and went through a couple of different incarnations in terms of, what I had been doing, work-wise, I think when I did start my own company, which would have been 1990, I think at that point, I started to have a sense in my mind that, I wanted it to be a reflection of, me and my tastes, and the reason why I got into it at the same time, and just try and do business in a way that was, sort of a day and night thing in terms of reflection of who I was or who I am, rather than feel like I can go and do my day job and be a devil, and then I can go home to my family in the evening and be, a saint, and I think that works for some people, and I think it does not work for a lot of other people. And I think that's totally fine, and I think, you just have to go through the world trying to find, those people that have some sense of empathy about who they are and what they're doing and what they're looking for in a business partner, and what they're not looking for in a business partner, and whether there's a match there or not. And I think it's become a lot easier for me to sort of define that or find that definition, as I've got on and got older and just sort of established my company and refined it. And I've tried things. I've tried working with different people, and by and large, you can sense fairly early on, whether it's going to be a match, or not. And again, I referred to this, what I wrote. You can define fairly early on, or get the sense fairly early on as to whether something's going to work or not. Some things have a natural lifespan. Some things don't have a lifespan, and that's just relationships. It's just any kind of relationship, whether it's a business relationship, a personal relationship, a friendship, or whatever it is, So I find it difficult to actually take away any personal aspect in terms of how I present myself, and the things that I'm interested in, how to remove those things and just present it in just a very simple kind of business manner. I'd find that really difficult, to be honest. I feel like I need to have something in common, with the people that I work with, and I feel like there needs to be some sort of sense of understanding as to what the kind of mutual needs are, if you like, and sense of comfort. Otherwise, it's very difficult. I mean, just waking up and feeling like you don't want to make that call, or you don't want to hear from that person, or it would just be very, 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 very difficult, And I guess what I've been trying to tell is the story of, finding my way through the independent world and being very happy in the independent world, but being able to do that at a time when it was difficult, but probably a lot easier to attempt this in the 70s and 80s rather than, the noughties, and where we are right now, where it's sort of much more difficult. I mean, you can't knock on doors, asking if they have any jobs, in the way that I did, in 1978, wandering around London, knocking on record company doors, walking in and just with no resume or anything, I mean, can you imagine that nowadays?
Yeah. I mean, you couldn't even get in the building. You
couldn't
get in
the
front
building.
desk.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Yeah, even the smallest of independents now are in these buildings in New York where you could walk by and there's a doorman and you're not getting on the elevator.
Yeah, I mean the danger for me is sort of not being nostalgic or too nostalgic about it.
Yeah, that's right.
And not necessarily considering it like being precious about it in terms of. Well, it was remarkable, what was remarkable was the music and the music industry at that time was remarkable. That was the fortunate aspect, and seeing, growing up, through at least two remarkable phases in England, which is sort of, 1970s, punk rock, and then 1980s, C86. Movement, and the birth of all those incredible bands, whether it was Joy Division or New Order or the Smiths or the Cocteau Twins or, I mean, amazing. Yeah. It's incredible. It was just, it reminds me in a very different way of like, I love this Laurel Canyon story, and I love that community aspect of it. And I loved how those people cross-pollinated and there was an exchange of all that ideas, but how much talent came through in a relatively short period of time and how condensed it was into a particular community, and it was just like, God, I mean, a record company and a manager's dream,
When you were working in England in the late 70s and early 80s in particular, were you aware of at the time, or is this just superimposed retrospectively? Of the notion of like that there were sort of catalysts. Were there people that were catalysts? Like what's been top of mind for me lately, just because I've been reading some stuff about that era, is the role that Trevor Horn played.
Yeah.
And it was like on every record, there was this period of time for 2 or 3 years that it was Trevor, big records, the big records that were coming out of England. But across crazy genres, like this just bizarre catalyst for what was happening in pop music then. Were there figures like that? What was the organic nature of the scene versus this notion that there were visionaries?
Yeah. I don't recall visionaries. Trevor Horn was obviously exceptional, and he was able to transcend, move in very different areas. And I think there's aspects of his, I don't know how much of ZTT, he was behind. Certainly he was involved, but there's people with him that were involved in that. I think there were musical visionaries who are still around making great music now, and have a remarkable body of work, whether they were people like Elvis Costello or, Nick Lowe. I think there were a lot of, great artists that came through at that time. Peter Gabriel, a little earlier on, through the prog rock thing, which is very big in England. Just, Rod Stewart, amazing career. I mean, incredible career. Whatever you think about his the second half of his career is by and by, But for me, first band I ever saw, Rod Stewart and the Faces. I mean, damn, when I had hair, I used to have my hair cut like Rod Stewart. Used to stitch tartan things into my jeans,
I have to ask you about the Faces. I mean, I because I associate you a bit more with like the post-punk sort of late 70s, early 80s on.
Yeah.
That's
yeah.
Call it a mental, it's just a mental model I built in my head of you. Talk to me about the Faces. Like, it's so funny because, especially in America, there's large swaths of music fans that, they don't know them. If you told them the story, they'd say, oh my God, that's where these people came from. But I feel like it's very hard to underestimate the impact of the Faces on British rock music.
Absolutely.
So why them, and where did they fit? Like, why did the world need the Faces at that time? What role did they play?
Well, actually, I think they were catalysts, and I think just going back for a second to the catalyst thing, I certainly think that there were record label people that were catalysts, a catalyst in the sense of recognizing something and then being able to exploit it and find it, and develop some sense of identity, in terms of who they were and what they were doing. And obviously I'm talking about Tony Wilson. Yeah. I'm talking about Ivor Watts Russell. I'm talking about Jeff Travis, Daniel, at Mute, Alan at Creation. They were catalysts, in terms of, again, being fortunate or skillful enough to surround themselves with the kind of people that it would be very, very difficult to do right now. Jack Riviera, had Nick Lowe, he had Elvis, he had Barney Bubbles as a sleeve designer, there was just Tony Wilson had Alan Erasmus, he had Rob Gretton, he had Peter Saville, remarkable, right? I mean, just remarkable people that, had these abilities to sort of forge something and be a catalyst. The Faces, they had an attitude about what they did and the way in which they presented themselves that was so opposed to what was going on at that time, because a lot of music at that time was very polished. There was a prog rock thing that was, crafted and brilliant, some great bands, but brilliant. But the Faces, they were like lads, so, descendants of the Faces. Believe it or not, the Sex Pistols, huge Faces fans because of their attitude and their approach. Oasis, huge Faces fans. In fact, particularly the Sex Pistols, there's a really funny version of Steve Jones singing, I think it's Ooh La La, just acoustic, with a guitar.
Oh, that's amazing.
I'm sure you'll find it online, and there was like a rock and roll carefree attitude, but it was also like the merging of sort of 3 or 4 people and talents that only happens once in a lifetime. And Joe Strummer speaks about this very eloquently at the end of, I think it was The Future Is Unwritten, or one of those films where, when he was talking about when he fired Mick Jones, who'd become a little bit too large for the band in terms of, Mick's whatever he was doing or saying, but talking much later on about feeling like, you only capture that magic once, and the idea that we could fire Mick Jones and bring in another guitar player and just replace him is just not it's not grounded in any reality,
Yeah.
you know. And the moment Ronnie Lane left the Faces, you know, and Tetsu came in, you know, the moment, you know, Rod's solo career became bigger than the Faces sort of, you know, band career, and his priorities shifted towards that. You know, you can't just, it's not like we'll get another bass player or we'll get another lead singer. You know, you can't, you know, Mick Hucknall can't be the singer of the Faces, you know.
Right.
I mean, that magic happens, you know, so it happens once in a lifetime, you know, and their music, I mean, their songs, and they all came from very different. I mean, you know, Rod Stewart was from the blues, you know, background, you know, with you know, the blues scene, and Long John Baldry, you know, and then Jeff Beck crafting through that, you know, and Ronnie Wood was the Byrds, you know, that band, the Byrds, you know, before it came. Ronnie Lane, the Small Faces. The people still think the Faces in this country are the Small Faces, you know. Yeah. But Ronnie Lane and Kenny Jones was in the Small Faces, and just that unique talent of, like, you know, two or three of them being able to write amazing songs, you know. It in the way that the Eagles, a band like the Eagles could do, for instance, where you've got two or three talents that come together and they can all write those kind of songs, you know, and trade off each other. But the Faces were just the epitome of rock and roll. Their records were, their live shows could be an absolute shambles. I mean, the first time I ever saw them play, they came on an hour late. They were drunk. Ronnie Wood couldn't stand up. He was falling down, you know.
Sound like the Replacements.
Yeah, a little bit. Well, the Replacements, I mean, you know, the Black Crowes, the complete descendants, you know, in terms of the attitude and the sound of the Faces and everything, but just songs that endure, you know. And they were the definitive bad boy kind of rock and roll, you know, band that was just having a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But you got the sense that they were like human beings there, you know.
Well, it's interesting because it seems like they stepped into the breach that the Stones left open when the Stones became, for lack of a better way to say it, like jet-settery and less accessible. The Faces, you know, remained that band that people sort of related to.
Yeah, totally relatable. I have one great memory of I was leaving the office in London. I had an office in central London. I was leaving late one Friday night, and I'm walking down the road, and I see this guy sitting on the sidewalk, and he's got his back to the pub, and he's got his legs on the sidewalk, and he's got a pint and a cigarette. And I'm thinking, I'm going to have to step over him. He's not going to move his legs. I hope this doesn't get uncomfortable. And as I get closer to him, I realize it's Ronnie Wood.
Of course. I was going to say it was Ronnie Wood, wasn't it?
So he's got the pint, he's got the cig, he's got his long legs sticking out. And I get close to him and he sees me and he looks up and the only thing he did was like, he nods at me and says, all right. All right. I'm like, I'm all right, you know? And I just step over his legs. And my first thought was, I got to go back to the office and get my Nods as Good as a Wink album and dash down here now, you know. But he's out there on the sidewalk on his own with nobody, just having a pint Friday night. And I'm just like, oh my God, you know, it's Ronnie Wood.
Yeah.
You know?
It's amazing to read stories about the Stones or even Ronnie in particular, but how long he was around, and like he was not, like he was a known factor, you know. I think that probably because of his personality and his sort of the sort of bubbling foible kind of personality he puts out there, he's very much underrated. And then of course the role he's kind of forced to play in the Stones, I think, boxes him in a little bit musically, but he's a much larger character and probably a more important character in the late 60s, early 70s British music scene than I think he gets acknowledgement for.
Absolutely. You look at all those great Faces songs and it's Stuart Wood, you know. So in the same way that you had, you know, Jagger Richards, Lennon McCartney, Stuart, I'm not comparing their works, but Stuart Wood, you know, all those amazing Faces songs, from those albums. They weren't around for that long a time, unfortunately. Like the Beatles, they weren't around for that long a time. But I mean, what a legacy, and what a I'm looking at my Genesis Faces publications book, which I don't know if you've ever seen.
I haven't seen that one. No.
It's a tome. Genesis Publications do these sort of complete books, and unfortunately, Rod did participate in that. It's got the signatures of all the other guys. It came out after Ronnie Lane had died, unfortunately. But Ronnie Lane, amazing songwriter, had success on his own, modest success. And there's a great film actually called The Passing Show, The Life and Times of Ronnie Lane, which is up on YouTube. And if you have any interest in the Faces, it's beautiful. It's really beautiful. The naivety of it, and just sort of, how is he a member of the Faces? And how could he do this after being in the Faces? Is so magical.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned the Eagles and the fact that there were multiple songwriters. It does seem like they could have had a very dominant career throughout the 70s. Who knows if they would have gone, the 40, 50 year mark, but you could imagine if Rod had been less sort of agitated about having a solo career, that they could have been a very meaningful band for a long time.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think, this is one of the problems of being in a band. One of the when you look at the pros and cons of being in a band, the pros are you've got a group of people that is your support system that you can work with and you can write with and develop things and go out and being live on stage is you're at your most vulnerable, so the idea of having this band behind you at all times and it being a collective thing, is very comforting. Where it becomes a problem, which I think it was for Rod Stewart, is feeling boxed in by the kind of record that you feel like you've got to make to be the Faces, rather than the kind of record that you want to make. It's like, it's fine Glyn Johns producing a Faces album, but I want Muscle Shoals, or I want Tom Dowd, because I want to make something that's sort of lusher and a little bit less rough around the edges. And I think from what I read and from what I know, that was the dynamic, going on there. But that's the dynamic with everybody, right? And I'm sure Noel Gallagher felt boxed in, personalities aside, within Oasis. It's like, I've really got to make another, turn it up as loud as possible can be, record for my brother to sing my songs, and just, the Smiths, I remember there was a great comment from Johnny Marr when they were talking about like the reasons why he left the Smiths, and I'm sure it was amplified or exaggerated a little bit. He said I'd been working on this piece of music for so long, and I was so happy with it, and I thought it was such a beautiful kind of riff, and I gave it to Morrissey, and it brings it back to me, and the lyrics are, "Some girls are bigger than others." Yeah, I knew at that point that maybe it was time to think about moving on.
Yeah, I think that illustrates the point. All right. Well, before I let you go, let's talk about Bowie for a minute, because that's sort of the context with which we first met.
Yeah.
Where did David fit for you as a fan growing up? It's always interesting to me to talk to people that grew up in England, especially in the early mid 70s, because again, I think he's one of those artists where he's been around so long, we forget the impact early on. Yeah. And put aside, the misfires in the early part of it, the Anthony Newley and all the other stuff. But, people talk about like that Top of the Pops appearance for Ziggy or
Starman.
Yeah, Starman. Sorry.
Starman,
where were you a Bowie fan in the 70s and 80s, and where did he fit in the pantheon for you?
Where he fitted was that I grew up in the north of England, which is a very small mentality, small town. growing up in an environment where you're led to believe and you're told that nothing is possible, and where you grow up, you're born here, you die here. This is what it is, and this is what we have to offer. Choose one. And David represented an other world. He represented another aspect and another world that was inconceivable. So when you're whatever age I was, when I see Starman on top of the pops and I see this guy, it's not so much sort of I want that. It's more, where does that come from? I was a huge David Bowie fan. The first reel-to-reel that I had was Man Who Sold the World, and I was so struck by how it sounded. I'd never heard anything sound like that before, and it was just like, it was just incredible, hearing that. So he was otherworldly. It was not David Bowie was not an artist like the Clash. Whereas when I first saw the Clash, it was like, I want to be involved in this. Not so much just sort of them, but this is so exciting to me. I somehow want to be involved in music. David represented another world that was so foreign and so abstract, that it was sort of inconceivable, So from the first moment I met David, from the very first meeting I had with David in Bill's office, to then get the job and then sit down in his Coco's living room, actually, with him. And for him to sit there with his sort of, his jeans on and his J. Crew sweater, and have his legs crossed. And I remember we were talking about doing this TV show, and he was like, yeah, I know what they're going to want me to do. They're going to want me to just sing all the old stuff. And, he's like, waboo, waboo. It sounds like mocking himself. And of course, to me, at the age of 18, hearing him sing that or whatever, I was like, yes, that's it. So otherworldly, that I was so fortunate to see and play a tiny, tiny, tiny part of, for 10 years, 12 years, whatever it was, and it's just, I could actually still cry, I think, about him dying,
No, I was actually getting a little choked up talking to you because, these are the days right now, his birthday and the anniversary of his passing. And
look, the artist to the end. His art and what he created, who he created, because I think when I was involved, he was really David Jones, right? You know what I mean? It was David Bowie, obviously, but his persona, his character was sort of, he dealt with him on a kind of David Jones kind of nature. It'd gone past that period of kind of defining, redefining, but I think that's just going to endure. I don't know anybody that's going to be able to do that the way he did it ever again, as eloquently and as brilliantly. And it was just so perfect, perfectly, desperately sad, that, and that body of work and what it means to so many people. I still, there's still things that come to me now, where I'll hear a song or, that song Starman reminds me of when I used to pick peas in the summer when I was at school, just leaving school. We'd pick peas in the field and we'd down the bags, when Starman came on, in the same way as when You Wear It Well came on,
That's so amazing. Yeah.
So it's to have that memory and then have the memory of 2000 and Heathen, and Reality and, the light bar. It's incredible. God, what do we live for? Just music,
Were you there when we did the show at Roseland where he played all of Heathen and then all of Low? Or maybe it was the other way around. And then the Little Greatest Hits. That was a peak experience. And I was with my wife at the time, and she said, "Oh my God, David sings from his hips." And I have that image in my head of him at the microphone, how he sings from his hips, but very Elvis. But
right. All those shows, the four shows, in Queens, Manhattan, the Little Staten Island show,
The marathon,
the Jimmy's Bronx, the Jimmy's Cafe up in the Bronx, and the book, that forgetting her name, Santos, published the photographs and everything. Yeah, amazing memories. Gail lives up here. I bump into Gail from time to time.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Is she working?
She is working. Yeah, she's working all the time. Yeah.
Good.
She does a lot of work with Lenny Kravitz, and she does a lot of her own work. She sang on the recent national album. She sang one or two songs, either on the national album or the lead singer.
Matt.
Matt Berringer. Matt Berringer, yeah. I think it was the national album, though. She sang on a couple of songs on the national album. And she still sings like nobody else can.
She was a revelation on the reality tour. She had that band had come into its own. The facility he had with that band to be able to play any part of his catalog convincingly.
Yeah.
It was, that was a impressive band.
She was a secret weapon in that band, really, I mean, total sweetheart, still is, Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for your time and for your insights. And
hope we covered enough, what you wanted.
I could do another hour or two with you, but it's so great to see you.
Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much, David Whitehead. I hope this was just part one of many parts of our discussion. Thank you, Aunt Taylor and the entire team at Light. As always, thank you for listening to Spotlight On. Get and share all of our past episodes, write a review, even send us a message through our website, spotlightonpodcast.com. Join us again next week. In the meantime, be safe and stay in touch.